This is the Roots and All podcast, here to help you get growing. Join us as we explore everything plant-related, both indoors and out, and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Presented by Sarah Wilson.
Hi, and welcome to episode 4 of the Roots and All podcast. This episode, I'm speaking to a garden design guru, Andrew Fisher Tomlin. Andrew's career in garden design is quite frankly stellar. Amongst his myriad achievements, he's a director of the London College of Garden Design, former head judge of RHS Show Gardens, partner in a successful London-based design practice, a fellow of the Society of Garden Designers, a chartered horticulturist with the Chartered Institute of Horticulture, an ambassador to Streetscape charity, and a liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Gardeners. And on top of all that, he holds the Sartorial Society's National Collection of check suits. I spoke to Andrew about what to consider if you're thinking of hiring a garden designer. Mr. Fisher Tomlin, thank you for joining me on the podcast. I just wanted to ask the very first question that I have, which I think is probably the most important initial consideration, and that is, why would somebody hire a garden designer and what will they bring to a project potentially?
It's interesting because garden design is a relatively young profession. There have been designers around for a very, very long time, but really with the advent of garden design on television things in the 90s and things, it's really taken off. And so it's easy to find a garden designer now. But, more than anything, the reason why people will go to a garden designer is because of their expertise. Most of my clients don't know how to approach the design of the garden. They don't know how to select plants and things like that. And I think that's one part of garden design which is really important to buy into, is that a properly qualified garden designer will be good at selecting the right materials and particularly the right plants for a garden. Mm-hmm. And that's a sort of obvious thing from a client point of view. But the bit that people don't always think about is about the value as well. I often save my clients from making expensive mistakes or spending too much money. I've often found that they've had advice from a landscaper or, say, someone like a driveway person, which is all about putting as much hard landscaping down as possible. And hard landscaping is the expensive part of doing a new garden. And I find time and time again that I do actually save my clients money.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Potentially you're paying out for a garden designer, but in the long run, it could benefit you financially. Well, that is a very interesting point.
I don't think there's ever a point where clients are surprised at how little a garden costs. They tend to understand if they're coming to a designer, they're going to have to invest a certain amount of money. But these days it is a good investment, not just in terms of the value that you put on your own property, but also in your health and well-being.
So if I was looking to hire a garden designer and I had no clue where to start, where might be the best places for me to go and find somebody? Are there websites, associations?
I think it's a bit like how we buy things generally now anyway, which is primarily on recommendation. And because garden design is quite widely used now, I'm sure within your own social circles, you'll be able to find garden designers that can be recommended by your friends. But also there are professional places to go as well. So the Society of Garden Designer has a list of registered members. And those registered members are a proportion of their membership that have actually gone through a rigorous process to be approved and become registered members. They have other members as well, which are often people who are going forward for that registration as well. But also find out locally what designers are around and have a look at their testimonials and see if other people are recommending them.
When I spoke to Claire Vokins about garden maintenance, we spoke about the various qualifications that gardeners could have. I think it's probably the same thing with garden designers, in as much as that there aren't such rigorous regulated standards for garden designers. In terms of qualifications, what would be really good ones to look out for if you were hiring a designer? And are they necessary even?
I think some training's necessary. Okay, there's plenty of people out there who are good designers who have no formal training, but they have a lot of experience, and you'll see that experience in their websites and the projects that they've done. And again, there, the testimonials that they might have from customers. If you go to a website and you like what you're seeing and there's testimonials there, then ask the designer if they can speak to one of their clients or something like that to find out how it won. That's a brilliant way of finding out if somebody's able to do what you want them to do. But there again, there are plenty of places where designers are getting training. So there's people like London College of Garden Design and the diploma there, which is recognised throughout the industry. People might have things like RHS level qualifications, which is more a qualification about an understanding of horticulture. That sort of training is also really useful. And then as designers develop their careers, they might be members of the Society of Garden Designers, or they might be design members for Bali, which is the Association of Landscape Industries, not a group of nice islands in the Pacific. But I would say always remember to see the testimonials and ask. People are obviously only going to put good testimonials on the website, but you can always ask to see somebody's projects or speak to a client. And we've sometimes used, particularly front gardens, we've said to prospective clients, we'll go and actually have a look at what we did there. And we're sometimes reliant on the clients actually looking after their gardens. But those things all help. I think you need to think what people are capable of. And in real settings, I find, because we do a lot of work overseas, that our overseas clients are very, very conscious that show gardens, things like Chelsea flower shade medals and all that sort of thing, they're very nice, but they're not real gardens, they're not real settings. And so we find that overseas clients actually discount them because when they look at British garden designers, they see that everyone's got an RHS medal. So what they're looking for is awards for real gardens.
Obviously, you said references are a good thing to take up. And again, the other thing that I was speaking to Claire about was insurance cover. So is it prudent to ask to see the proof of insurance? And do designers actually need a slightly different type of insurance to, say, a maintenance person or a landscaper?
I think garden designers should always have insurance, and you should ask to see or ask them what their insurance is and the level of insurance cover they have. Like somebody who is in maintenance, then you would expect them to have their third-party insurance. But garden designers also tend to have professional indemnity insurance. And that's about indemnifying the design work they're doing, ensuring that design work. I think as a minimum, that should probably be about £250,000, which for the designer isn't an expensive thing to buy. But most residential jobs certainly are below £250,000, and that would cover any major issues that come from design. There is also, alongside this, under CDM regulations, which came in 2015, garden designers need to be starting health and safety records as soon as they're designing, and those sort of health and safety records about the design would then be passed to the landscaper, who then takes responsibility for them. So it's sort of two sides of the same coin. One is about insurance. The other side is about actually looking at things like health and safety, because often insurance claims come out of problems with health and safety.
The other thing that I was going to ask, because I think probably people are a little bit confused about it when they're starting to look for a designer, is there is obviously a difference between a landscape architect and a garden designer. How might somebody know which one of those that they needed? And can you summarise the difference?
Yeah, traditionally the difference between a garden designer and a landscaper is a garden designer tends to be working in a residential, private realm, whereas landscape architects tend to be working in the public realm. But there is much more of a crossover these days, often because landscape architects really enjoy the private realm, doing large residential gardens. But I think it goes back to, when you are looking at who you would appoint, question the landscape architects about their experience for a residential project, and vice versa for a garden designer. Garden designers often take on public realm, community gardens, what I often call sort of privately owned spaces but publicly accessed, because they tend to be smaller spaces, and garden designers are often better at looking at those and certainly tend to have more skills when it comes to the planting design. But it's horses for courses. It's about finding the right person for your project.
I've recently had some work done at my house, and obviously I've got experience of garden design, but I do work with the landscapers quite a bit. And the guys that came out to do my hard landscaping also offer a design service as part of their overall service. So I think a lot of people might get a landscaper out initially to look at, say, putting in a terrace or a patio. And I think at that point, a lot of landscapers might say, you know, look, we're capable of doing the design. Don't worry about getting a garden designer in. We can do everything. Obviously, some landscapers are more than capable of doing that. Is this a service that they charge for? And is it advisable to get them to do the design? It's probably, you know, how long's a piece of string, really. But is there a way of saying this is what you could expect from a landscaper? This is maybe why you should or shouldn't get them to do your plans?
Yeah, no, it goes back to that thing about, do I need a garden designer? And I'd always say it depends, because you need to be asking what their design credentials are, really. Have you found somebody who's designed lots of gardens that they've designed and built that you like? That's fine. If you see that they are a design and build firm and they might even employ a designer, then fine. And there are plenty of designers who actually now employ maintenance teams or build teams as well. It's like all things, it really depends, really. And I'd certainly think, look at their design credentials. If they've built gardens that you like, that's fine. If they've designed them, one question I'd always ask is, do their gardens all look the same?
Yeah.
Because sometimes there's a repetition, and the designer is probably going to, in those circumstances, work closer to your brief. But then, hey, if you like what they've done, then in some ways that's fine. So it depends, really. I think just go back to the particular circumstances. I get quite frustrated that people who specialise in front garden driveways and things, they just pave over the whole thing. And okay, they've got to work to current legislation for drainage and things like that, but they don't necessarily come to that project with a design eye and make your house look attractive, unless all you want is some huge layer of block paving. I don't find that most people want that. And as we said earlier, a designer can save you money as well and put money in the right place. There are, in my experience, very few landscapers who have good planting knowledge, but that's not to say there aren't thereabout. And I've often at the London College of Garden Design, I've had landscapers come on our planting design course because they want to learn more about plants. But ultimately, a really good landscaper is going to know at what point they need to hand over the design to a designer. And they will often have people that they've worked with building for another designer anyway. So they will know good garden designers that they can recommend to you.
Again, with all of these kind of questions, it's dependent on what suits you if you're looking to hire somebody. With that in mind, I suppose it leads on to my next question, which is, if you wanted somebody to come in and do a design, could you expect them to just give you, say, a layout plan of the garden, or are you looking for them to actually go all the way and project manage?
My opinion, and I teach students this, if you as a designer are going to see a potential client and you're showing them both sorts of drawings and talking about the process and showing them completed gardens, the client is expecting you to be there for the whole journey. Mm-hmm. And especially if a designer is saying to you, well, actually, I will personally select and supply you with plants, or I will help you find furniture and things. They are part of the build process. So in many ways, you should expect the designer to be with you on that journey, but you would need to pay for that as well, because obviously they spend a lot of time doing that. Mm-hmm. If you just want a design, that's fine as well, but talk to the designer about it. They might not be prepared to just do a design and hand it over to somebody, but they might be happy to do that. What I find is most people who go to garden designers go to them because they don't have a good plant knowledge. And so sometimes we get people who say, well, I've just moved into a new house. We've got the structure of the garden, but we have no plants. Would you come and do a planting design? And again, if the garden designer is happy to do that, bring them in and do that part of the process as well. But generally, I think you should think about a garden designer coming in for the whole sort of journey from that first inception of what the structural design is through to planting design and handing over the garden at the other end.
So with that in mind, if you were looking to them to provide you with a whole concept for the entire space that you want designed, I think people maybe don't understand what they're going to get as part of that package. And I know one of the things that we initially discussed was what can people expect to see in terms of drawings or projections of how the garden's going to look as a finished entity. Is that something people could expect to receive?
Yes, there's a couple of different sort of areas of drawings and things. The first is the master planning and the perspectives, the sort of drawings that as a client are going to help you understand what you're going to get. So in particular, they are perspectives and elevations and things, which in gardens which are not entirely flat, where there are level change things, are great for you understanding how you're going to move around the garden, what you're going to get structurally. So that's the first part. But the second part, which people often don't think about, are actually the more important drawings. They're the working drawings. They're the drawings which are going to go to the different landscapers if you're going out for a tender, or just to your landscaper if you're just going to one particular person. And they'll have all the construction detail in, the layout of the garden, for the technical drawings, which are also backed up by a good specification for how the materials are going to be selected, how they're going to be installed. So that's a really important part that people perhaps don't think about, and a lot of what you're paying for. But on top of that, then, you're also going to be getting documents such as mood boards, which might show you the feel of the garden through images, but also particularly in terms of planting design, mood boards where you can actually see what the feel of the plant is going to be at different times of the year, and specifications of the plants are going to be supplied and at what cost. So there's quite a lot of documentation there. And I always say to people, it's not about a lot of pretty pictures. It's actually the most important part of those sort of technical documents, which are going to make sure that you get the garden that you first thought about and imagined. But the one proviso on that, I'd always be very, very careful about and think about when you are getting drawings, is when you get sort of photoreality drawings. You know, the sort of, we're all very aware these days of photoshopped images, and designers can produce, you know, amazing photorealistic drawings, but just remember we are working with material, i.e. plants, that's going to change tomorrow. Unlike most design where, you know, like architects who are going to draw something and that's what you're going to get, plants are going to change quite rapidly. So a designer might show you a photorealistic drawing with a particular tree in, but when the tree comes, it might be slightly smaller, it might be larger, it will be a different shape. So always remember that it's not going to look exactly like the photo.
Okay, yeah, well, that's really interesting. So use the drawings as a guide for the overall feel, but don't necessarily slavishly hold to the actual look in the drawing. I mean, it's really just an artistic impression.
You can expect that on structural drawings, but outside we often use natural stone as well. So there, you know, you might look at a sample and the sample might be one paving slab, but natural stone will vary in colour, it will vary in the sizes and things like that. So quite often it's a good idea to see an image of it as a laid product. And there are good stone suppliers like CED and London Stone that have pictures of the installed stone. So you get a good idea of the variation in colour, any irregularities and things like that, which is much better than looking at a small sample. So just be careful of all the photoreality drawings about looking at samples and think about, you know, how is this going to look installed in my own garden and over a larger area as well.
If somebody contacts a garden designer, generally what would be the process? And obviously we've touched on finances and we'll touch on that again after this question, but in terms of things like the initial visit, my lovely dentist has recently had a fantastic garden designer go round who actually did charge for the initial visit, and she was quite surprised at that initially, but then completely came round to the idea and has had a wonderful relationship with this designer. But I think maybe sometimes there is a lack of understanding that when you're hiring a professional such as a designer, they are going to charge you, like many other professionals will, on an hourly rate for every aspect of the work that they do. So I think maybe that's a consideration to bear in mind. What would be the sort of initial process and how would that go on throughout the project?
Let's talk about that charging thing first anyway.
Okay.
I think it's a very personal decision whether you are happy to accept an initial charge for a visit or whether a designer actually charges for that. And I can tell you what I feel and what we do, which is actually if we are going to see people locally, and I live in London, so I have a lot of people locally, then we don't charge for that initial visit. Because in my opinion, they're going to pitch for the business, they might be seeing some other designers. That said, I'm not spending a huge amount of time there. I'm probably going to see somebody for an hour or so and talking about their project, listening to what they are looking for, and giving them some of my knowledge in terms of how much things cost. So there's some understanding before we go further forward. And then I'll come back to the office and I will send them a proposal. So I'm not spending a lot of time at that. Whereas other designers might go to see somebody and spend 2 or 3 hours and be taking a brief and things because that client has said to them, actually, you know, you're not my number one. I really want to see you. I'm pretty certain I'm going to go with you. So can you come and take a brief and things? So in those circumstances, I can understand why there might be an initial charge for a call out. If I go further than about 25 miles, then I would expect to charge some sort of call out fee as well. So it very much depends on the project, the garden designer, the client, what's required. Are there other garden designers pitching for that business? Have a think about it from that point of view. The typical process is that once you've made that initial contact, a designer will come and visit you, obviously in your own garden. And sometimes that own garden is still a building site, but they should still come out and see the site and particularly look at the surroundings, look at the aspect of the garden, talk about what you are looking for, and don't expect to get lots of ideas for free. And even if you do get a few ideas from that designer, just remember that it's perhaps only 10% of what they're going to do for you. And if you then commission them, they may well come back with some even better ideas next week. So you're not going to get lots of ideas, but you are going to have a conversation about what you have and the location and what you're looking for. So it's always good to have a think about, you know, what sort of gardens do you like? Do you like contemporary gardens, traditional gardens? And places like Pinterest are a really good way of finding out and getting an eye in for the sorts of things you like. And you might well show that to a potential designer. You don't have to have reams and reams of things. It might be only 3 or 4 photos of things that you do like. And also, you've probably gone to them because you like what's on their website as well. So tell them what it is on there about their website and some of the sort of portfolio that you like, so that they start to get a picture of what you're looking for. So that's that initial visit. And at that point, they may well do it in front of you, but they should always back it up in writing with a proposal, which will tell you what they're going to do. So it's like a scope of works and at what cost. But that's that initial phase. You will then commission them. And depending on what that first meeting was about, they will likely come back and do a survey and take more of a brief and talk to you more about what you're looking for.
Obviously, you're providing them with ideas of your own and pictures of things you like, but you are ultimately employing them because you're buying into their design vision. How much compromise is there involved in that process? Can you expect them, if you have got a vision of a red pagoda and black tiles and exotic planting, and yet you've picked someone who's kind of more known for their country estates, how much are they going to be prepared to listen to your vision and execute that? Or are you expecting them to just dictate everything in the garden to their tastes and styles?
I think it's about the attitude of designer to an extent, because you're sort of saying, will they listen to me? Are they going to stick to just their own style and things? And strangely enough, I have recently had an old client come back to me who said to me they really like a Japanese garden. They want a red and black building, strangely enough.
Yeah, I've had that. I was drawing on experience from that, actually, that scenario.
But it's strangely about that. It's like, for me, I'm thinking, oh, great, something different.
Yeah.
And we're always looking for something different as well. Design is about solutions. It's not great art. And there are plenty of designers I've come upon in the past who think they're great artists, and they put 3 plants together, and they think, aren't I marvellous and aren't I an artist? You think, well, you've seen it many times before. It is about solutions, and they need to be listened to you as a client and advising you in the best possible way. And if that's something that's not going to work or is wrong, let's say you would really like decking right outside your house, which is north facing, and you're not going to get any sun on it at all, that designer should be sort of pointing out to you that that decking is probably going to get quite slippery and will need lots of maintenance. They're not necessarily saying you shouldn't have that, but they should be advising you on the right materials. It's the same with if you say to them, oh, you know, my little 5x5 metre garden, I really love birch trees. They should be telling you what happens to a birch tree and how it will take over your garden. So if it's not going to work, they should be advising you, but they should also be inspiring you.
Yeah.
And they should be inspiring you with ideas that you've not thought about. That's the value in getting a garden designer. It's about that inspiration. It doesn't hurt to show them some of the things you like. And I've often said to clients when it comes to plants, they might say, oh, I love roses and lavender and Russian sage and I want herbs in the garden. And that's always really useful. But sometimes it's also useful to say to the designer, but I don't like phormiums, I don't like big foliage and things like that. Because sometimes that's going to help them get a better idea about what you like and what's going to make a successful garden for you. Because once they're finished, it's your garden, it's not their garden. So you want somebody who's going to listen to you. And I suspect most of the time, because you'll have seen their work in advance through websites and things, you'll have a fair idea what they're capable of and whether you're going to speak each other's language anyway.
Going back to the process, so we've got the initial visit, we've touched on the structural drawings and specifications, and also I'm guessing that there would be a cost involved for things like a planting plan, a cost involved for project managing, so overseeing the landscapers.
Yeah, I think just going back to that processing, once you think you commissioned a designer, expect them to come back within 2 or 3 weeks with some initial master plan and maybe some visuals and things so you get to know what the garden is. And they may come back with their proposal for your garden, but also maybe a few options. And those options might be different materials, or at the end of this path, would you like a seat or would you like a water feature? So they'll talk to you about that so that they can go away and then do a final design. And I think because you've had lots of conversations at that second meeting, you're probably 90% there. You might be 100% there, but you should be about 90% there. And then they can go away at that point, do a final master plan, do all those construction drawings and put a specification out and be able to then get you a price. They probably have been able to give you a good guideline price anyway for having had that initial conversation with you, but you now want fixed prices.
Yeah.
So at that stage, you're going to have fixed prices. You then agree with them which landscaper is going to do it at which price, because it's not always about price. Sometimes it's about the availability of the landscaper. Most garden designers will have a number of landscapers in their stable who, you know, one might be better at small gardens, one might be more capable in large gardens. And that's where the advice comes in. That's when you need to be listening to your designer when they're saying, actually, this is going to be the best person for the job, to take that advice because it's what you're paying them for. So at this stage, we've got the landscaper, we've got something in the diary for when they're going to start. And that's probably when the designer is going to start looking at the detailed planting. So they may well have given you an idea of what planting is going to be like. They might have given you some mood boards, so you've got an idea. But I certainly find that if we give our clients a little bit more time and some initial mood boards, they start thinking about it, they start noticing plants that they might like. You obviously, as a designer, are the specialist and can bring that to the table. But with a little bit more time, you're going to get the best possible planting design. So that's that stage. By the time you're starting on site, you've got all the final construction drawings, you've got a good idea of what you're doing with the planting, and you can move ahead. But also the designer is in there to help manage the project, but they are on your side. They're not on the landscaper side. They will try and work with the landscaper, and that's why it's good to take their advice on the landscaper, because often there's that experience of working with a landscaper. I, for instance, have a landscaper I've worked with for 25 years, and some of the guys who've worked for that company have been there for 30 or 35 years. So there's that shared experience which makes the build much easier and understandable. And I know when I've got to go in, and I know what to expect from that landscaper. And that's what you're buying into as a client.
Mm-hmm.
The designer should be giving you a regular update. And I would say that a designer should be turning up on site on average about twice a week. But in the early stages, when there might just be a lot of excavations, things like that, it might just be once a week. And then, further down, when you're doing planting and things, the designer might be there a little bit more until the project is completed. Which is why often it's good to choose a local designer, because they are on the spot. And if a landscaper rings them up on a Tuesday evening and says, could you come round tomorrow because I've just got a question to ask you about how we're going to lay the paving, for instance, then it's more than likely that designer can turn up quickly.
So in terms of the budget, because as you said, the designer is going to come back to you with final costs once you've agreed the design, but is it realistic for you to be discussing your overall budget when you very first meet the designer? Because presumably you don't want to go too far down the road if they're expecting you to spend £30,000 on a garden and you've got 3.
It's a conversation to have about the cost of things, and a good designer will be able to tell you how much things cost. To give you some rough guidelines. So, if you're having a conversation and you're saying to them, I don't need a big terrace, I just want a small area at the bottom of the garden where my husband and I can sit there, in the evening. I don't have parties, but I probably have family round, so I only need so much space. The designer will get a fair idea about how much hard landscaping is going in there compared to somebody who says we have big parties and we want an outdoor kitchen and things like that. So they can give you some guideline costs at that point. So you get an idea about what your budget should be, because I think people have an idea in their head to why they're going to spend that amount. So get those guideline costs from the designer first and work together to think about what a good budget would be, rather than just saying, I want to spend X amount. I do have clients who've said that to me, and then told me what they would like, and I've advised them that, well, maybe you can't do all of it. But I would rather work through and say, well, this is potentially what things might cost, and go from there. And if it's, because of their guideline budgets, and if a client says to me, you've come in at about, it's going to cost between 30 and 40,000, I would rather it be nearer the 30,000, then we can design with that in mind. And it doesn't necessarily mean you get less of a garden. You might get less of the paving. It might be that we say, well, actually, there are certain elements of garden, things like lighting and water, that are quite expensive within the garden. And we might look at, do we need that at this point? But then you can retrofit those when you can afford it.
Yeah.
So if you say to your design, look, I can afford £30,000. The other things like lighting, I can't afford at the moment. The designer then can design in things like conduits under the paving and things to actually save you money when you can get round to fitting lighting and things like that.
So that's another example of getting somebody in who knows what they're doing to save you money and do things right in the first place.
Then it's not costing you later on.
So I've been quite keen to lift the veil on a lot of the garden-related things, and Claire and I spoke on maintenance, and we discussed what might be a average rate to pay per hour for somebody to do garden maintenance. Is it possible, could you give a ballpark figure for maybe the lowest rate and the highest rate you might expect to pay?
On maintenance, I actually feel that people don't take maintenance seriously enough, and they don't understand that, in my opinion, gardeners is the most noble profession within my industry, because there's an expectation of a huge amount of knowledge. I teach at Wisley to RHS students and at Kew, to apprentices at the Royal Park Guild and things like that. And I say to them, look, you're like a GP in the garden. Okay, it's not life-threatening. It's not what GPs do, but you do need to know so much.
Yeah.
And from that point of view, you need to actually, people need to respect what you do and also have an understanding that you've got huge amounts of training to get there. And I think as an absolute minimum, people should be paid at least £25 an hour as gardeners, and potentially a lot more if you're going in as a team as well. And I find that clients don't always understand that if you are having somebody in for 3 hours, that gardener is perhaps only going to be able to do 2-3 hour slots that day. So they've got a 6-hour day, but 2 hours in between where they're not getting paid, and they've got tools and vans and everything to pay. So I'll just say to clients, if anybody thinking of taking on a garden, have a think about what their costs are and how much time they are going to be working with you. And don't expect somebody to turn up for an hour a week just to mow your lawn and pay them a pittance.
I think you'll find Claire and I were doing the same thing. We were, trying to champion the gardeners.
Because garden designers tend to get paid better. I don't have a view on an hourly rate because I think clients like to be charged a fee in different ways. I think every garden is different and every service is different what the people are expecting. What I can tell you is what we would do in our business, and anything up to a value of about £50,000, we would charge fixed fees on a number of levels. So we would charge for doing a master plan, for doing those construction drawings, for doing the planting design, and for the management part of it. And the management part is the flexible bit. I will give an estimate on how many visits I need to make, but it would be the flexible part, because if something happens or the client then delays the project and I suddenly have to do twice as many visits, then ultimately I should be paid for those because it's still my time.
Yeah.
So we do those on a fixed rate up to about £50,000. And over that, we will tend to do them on a percentage of the cost of the project. And that would be, depending on the project, between 10 and 15%.
Okay.
And even up to £50,000, I would be expecting to charge around 15% of the cost of the project.
Okay.
And that, for me, means that I get a reasonable sum for my time and fee, and the client is getting good advice as well. There are designers out there who will charge you for a £50,000 job, whereas I'm charging £7,500. They will charge you £500. You always have to think, but where are they making their money? Are they going to offer that service for a start? Where are they making their money? Are they getting a kickback from the landscaper? Are they making their money by flogging you other stuff? Seriously think, why are they cheaper? I always remember going to see a potential new client, and at the end of the meeting she said, how much are you going to charge? I told her, and she said, but all your rivals are doing this for free. I said, well, think about why they're doing it for free, because surely somewhere they're making money.
Yeah.
And she went with me. She understood that and she commissioned me. And I later found out that 2 of those other 4 people were taking 30% from the client. At that time, I was charging 10%. And the other people were actually taking 30%. So think about how they're getting paid. I do have people who say to me, no, I don't want to charge you a percentage because you are going to use expensive materials. You'll put everything into making an expensive job so that you get a higher fee. That's fine. That can be their opinion. I always think, well, I'm as good as my last job and I don't want to be thought of as too expensive and things like that. And I won't do that. But if they think that's fine and they want me, but they want to charge an hourly rate, I always say to my clients who want me to charge an hourly rate, at the end of the project, I will tell you what the hourly rate has been and I will tell you what the percentage is, and you can decide which fee you pay. You can pay the higher or the lower. It's up to you.
Yeah.
It's funny how people never pay the higher, which tends to be the hourly rate.
Oh, that's interesting.
I generally don't charge hourly rates.
Well, that's really good to know. I think that is very helpful. And I think people need to know much more about how things are charged for, and also the expertise that they're getting for what they are paying. I don't think that's commonly recognised. So just in terms of some final words of advice with regards to a garden designer, what would you say are the key things to getting the best out of a relationship with your designer and making sure everything ends successfully?
Don't expect them to be your friend, but do expect them to be on your side. They are working for you they're not working for a landscaper. They definitely shouldn't be taking commission from the landscaper. But if they say they supply plants at retail prices or furniture at retail prices, then respect that. It's part of their income, and that's why they are charging you certain fees and things like that. So definitely respect that and don't expect things for free. But certainly you need to feel that you can add in your ideas as well. I have clients who are really good plants people, and they want a garden for them to garden in, but they're actually few and far between. Most of my clients come to me who have no idea about gardens. All they know is they want a nice garden. So, be talking to your designer about what you are able to manage when the garden becomes yours. Do you want to go and do a few courses to find out how to look after your garden, or do you want to hand that over to a regular maintenance person? And those regular maintenance people, especially where I am in South West London, are few and far between and in great demand. So the best advice I can give you is to be very open and honest with your designer, but expect the same back. Mm-hmm. And if there's something you're not happy with, if you are confused, make sure you ask those questions before things happen, because it then becomes an expensive thing to put things right.
Well, a huge thank you to Andrew for his insight into hiring a garden designer. I hope this has been helpful if you're thinking of getting someone in to design your outdoor space. As I said at the end of the conversation, communication is key. This was the final takeaway point from episode 2 on hiring a gardener too, and I think probably as a general life principle, you can't go wrong if you live by this tenet. I think it's important to speak with your designer at length about how you'll be using the garden, and also speak to other garden users, i.e. your family members, and make sure everyone's on board with the design. Also make a point of speaking with your designer about how much time and or money you'll be prepared to spend on looking after the design once it's finished. Also make a point of speaking with your designer about how much time and or money you'll be prepared to spend on looking after it once it's finished, so you're not saddled with a high-maintenance garden if that's not what you want. And just another point that I'd like to touch upon, as Andrew mentioned, good garden design is about solutions, not about art. A swanky-looking garden that you can't use in a comfortable or logical fashion is no use to anyone. You need a designer who's as much focused on things like the route of a path, its width, and how the chosen material will perform under different weather conditions and so on, as much as they are focused on getting the right shade of stone to complement the brick of your house. When I'm wearing my garden maintenance hat, one of the problems that I face is that novices and even professionals sometimes don't understand how a garden will mature. Asked to see pictures of a garden that's been built a year or 2 or 3 or even 5 years ago by the designer, this will give you an idea about whether they can design with an eye to the future. The only thing to be aware of here is that a garden design is always reliant on maintenance, especially the planted aspect of the design. Images of a design a few years down the road will show to a degree that the garden was designed with a maintenance budget and constraints in mind, but it will also show the designer has maintained an ongoing relationship with the client, which could be a good indicator of their ability to work successfully with their clients. Andrew touched on the issue of what you should be paying a gardener as well. If you'd like to read my article on what you should be paying, go to the Roots and All website, which is rootsandall.co.uk, click on the blog tab on the homepage and read the blog post titled, How Much Should You Be Paying a Gardener? If you have any questions or suggestions for topics you'd like to see covered in future episodes, please email me on podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. If you've enjoyed this episode, please could you rate and review it in iTunes? This is really helpful in terms of helping other people find the podcast so that they can benefit from the wisdom imparted by my fabulous guests. And if you want to be even more lovely, you can go to patreon.com/rootsandall. You can make a one-off donation or you can subscribe to support the podcast. So that's it. Thanks again to Andrew and thanks for listening. And I'll speak to you again soon.
For more information, visit the Roots and All website at rootsandall.co.uk. To download more episodes, visit iTunes, your favourite podcast provider, or get them direct from our website.